So people always say to me after my sermons, like, Lucas, you always preach on such light and fluffy topics. Why don't you ever go deep? I'm just kidding. I don't know if anybody's ever said that to me, and today's not going to be an exception. Today, I will be handling some more sensitive issues, and so I want to give you a content warning for that, and I also want to assure you that whatever you choose to do, whether you stay in here and listen or whether you decide it would be better for you to step out, that is, all of those options are available and welcome. I will be talking about a drug overdose, and I will also be talking about abuse. So the parable of the prodigal son has a traditional interpretation. And this is true for most of the parables. They're kind of handed down with an interpretation that kind of wraps them up with a neat bow, and they're sort of handed to us. And what I appreciate about the parables, and what I appreciate about scholars who really dig into these stories, is that the traditional meaning is often far less certain as the intended interpretation than we might have initially thought. And in fact, part of the beauty of a parable itself, parable means to throw meaning to the side. And one of the beauties of that is that it leaves itself open to many different interpretations. And I think that that is a piece of what Jesus was doing when he was teaching. He wanted to say something provocative that would really make you think and consider things, rather than clinching a meaning and handing it over to you in a neat bow. And that is true for the parable of the prodigal son. The traditional interpretation of the story of the prodigal son, is that the younger son who went and squandered everything, spending it on all sorts of luxuries, including prostitutes and wealthy, it's just kind of wasted all of his money. He comes back and he repents, and he begs his father for forgiveness. And he says, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to now, live responsibly with you, and I'm going to make that promise to you, so that as I come back as your son, you can rely on me and trust me and welcome me back into the home. And that therefore the father throws open the doors and puts the robe on him and kills the fatted calf and has this big party. And then we think about the older brother who has skepticism about all of this, and the traditional interpretation is that he's filled with resentment, and he shouldn't be. He shouldn't be so resentful. Like, let go of some of that resentment and just celebrate that this younger son has come back and repented and is now, going to be reintegrated into the family. I want to suggest that that's not actually what the parable is about. I want to suggest that that interpretation is actually really kind of not there. The younger son comes back and he does not repent. He does not repent. Instead, he comes back after he runs out of all of his resources and kind of crawls his way back. And it sounds like he's kind of says the right thing. I squandered, all of my money, and I, sinned against you in heaven. And then the father throws this luxurious party for him, and he's like, yeah, let's go, let's party. There is no evidence there that he has changed his ways, that he has made a promise that he's going to live differently going forward. Nonetheless, the father invites him back and plans to give him a lot more stuff. So if I was the older son, I would be pissed too. And I think, what would this look like kind of in today's terms, in the ways that, we might think about it today? Can anybody throw out a word, what the father might be doing? Enabling. That's right, the father is enabling this this behavior. And so I want to say, I think that there's a possibility that we could look at this parable and say, the father is a fool. The father is the fool in this story. And maybe the younger brother is the one who may have gotten things right. I want to tell you a story. And I decided that I had to wait a year to tell this story because it's one that means a great deal to me. It's about a friend that I had out in California. I was in my first ministry, and I think it was like 2 or 3 years in. I was feeling very, very lonely because I knew nobody out there. And I connected with the brother of a congregant, and he was not a member of the church, but this brother invited me to hang out with this circle of friends. And they were all gay men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so they kind of fawned on me being this younger gay guy, and they thought that being a minister was adorable. And they, it was a really, it was a really, really sweet group of people. And it did ease my loneliness quite a bit. I befriended this one guy in particular. His name is Glenn. And Glenn was really interested in questions of spirituality and religion. And he said to me, I want to meet with you over coffee so that you can teach me how to pray. And I said to him, how about we learn how to pray together? And, rather than me kind of being the expert on this. And, so we sat down and we read this wonderful book that I still recommend to people. It's called Help, Thanks, Wow by Anne Lamott. And it's a book about prayer. And one of the things that he said to me in that meeting was that this has opened me up to understand prayer in a completely different way. I now understand prayer is not trying to steal something from the future, but rather giving thanks for what you have right now. And I thought that was just a beautiful and powerful interpretation of prayer, and it really hasn't left me. Over the afternoons that I got to spend with Glenn, we would sit outside in the summer heat of Livermore, which could climb up to 110 sometimes. And they said it was a dry heat, so it wasn't as bad. It was still pretty bad. But we would often still sit outside, under the trees and have our iced coffee or iced tea and chat about things. And Glenn told me stories from when he was growing up, and he shared these stories publicly, so I'm not breaking any pastoral confidence here or anything like that. He grew up in the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, not the easiest place to realize that you're gay. As he was growing up, he had a very hard childhood. He was abused repeatedly by one of the members of his family. But he survived that, and he grew up, and as he was a teenager, he realized that he was gay, and he realized that this is something I will never, ever share with anybody. I'm going to keep it a secret. After he graduated with his associate's degree, he was able to get a job as a teacher, and he really wanted to help kids. That was his mission, and he became a high school teacher. He got the salary that he earned at that time was $19,000 a year. So he lived in an apartment that had no furnishings except some lawn furnishings that he was able to get from a yard sale. And he just really lived in, basic, just poverty level almost conditions. And he did it because he was so passionate about the kids. He finally moved to San Francisco, came out, he met the love of his life, and this was during the 1980s, and he lost the love of his life to AIDS. But he survived that, and he continued to find ways to connect with people and give of his time. He ended up becoming an operator at a telecommunications company, and I joked about him about, like, what was it that, were they still doing that thing where you had to, like, connect with and he was like, no, it was later than that, but it was, kind of, he worked on the tech end of that telecommunications agency. He sort of switched from helping high school students, but he became really passionate about animals. He just loved animals, and he couldn't have any in the place that he lived, but he volunteered his time at an animal shelter most weekends. And he found this group of friends, the same one that I was, welcomed into, and really felt connected. Back during the 1980s, after he lost the love of his life, he started to go to clubs and party, and in the context of that pounding techno music and the crush of bodies and all of the dancing that was happening there, and he found some release from the pain that he was holding, from the grief, from the trauma of what he had grown up in. And in a weaker moment, in one of those clubs, one of those bodies pressed up against him and said, "I have something that you might want to try." And he said, "What is it?" The guy said, "It's crystal." And so he tried it for the first time, and the way he described it to me is that the gates of heaven and hell opened at the same time. He started to take it regularly. He started to, chasing that high, it became more and more dangerous. And so finally he decided to get sober, and he became really committed to getting sober. That lasted for about a year, and then he relapsed. And then he would go back to being sober, and it would last 6 months, and then he would relapse. And this was a pattern that carried through to him up to the time that I knew him. Now, when I knew him, he said that this was the time. He knew it. This was the time he was going to get better. He knew that he was no longer going to use crystal meth. The first time that he used that I knew him, he called me and said that he was deeply scared that somebody was listening in on the phone conversation that we were having. And I didn't know anything about crystal meth. I had to educate myself after this, and I found out that paranoia is one of the things that comes up, during use. And he thought that people were listening to him through the outlets in the walls. And, so I started to get a sense that, like, something is really not right. I didn't know whether it was a mental health episode or if it was, that he was using. And it turns out that he was using. And that first day he said, "I need you to come over to my apartment. I don't feel safe. I'm in danger." And I felt uncomfortable with that. So I said, "I can meet you in a public place." And so we went to a park together, and I sat with him, and he was still quite paranoid. But as the day went along, I stayed with him for about 6 hours, and he finally kind of came down from that. And then I told him, I'm happy to be your friend, but I'm not the right person to be able to help you with this. And, you need to get in touch with your network of support that specifically helps with this, and the appropriate mental health professionals. And he did. And then once again said, "Okay, this is it. This is the time. I'm really going to put this down. I'm not going to use again." About 2 months later, he called me, deeply paranoid, and he had used again. Same pattern. And then the third time was kind of a turning moment for me, because the third time I said to myself, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. Like, I have lots of other connections at this point. I have these other guys who were in the group. I had developed other friendships through yoga and through some other outlets that I had. And I was like, I don't know if I want to keep introducing this level of chaos into my life. And so I really thought about just telling Glenn, "You know what, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore." But I didn't. And I'm not exactly sure why. I cared about him, and I enjoyed our conversations, and I wanted the best for him. And so I continued to meet him for coffee. I no longer, I made some clear decisions about the boundaries that I would have in that relationship. I was not going to go over there if he was high, and he needed to get help and support from appropriate resources. I was not able to provide that, but I continued to have afternoon conversations with him, and he shared the stories about how he grew up and what he wanted to do with his life, and the loss of his partner, and his love for animals. And we really had a very nice friendship. We had a very good friendship. I was driving to Cincinnati last August, and I looked down at my phone because it was ringing, and it was Robert, who was one of our mutual friends. And I didn't even need to answer. I knew what he was going to say. But I picked up, and he said, "Are you driving?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You need to pull over." And just then, it was almost like it was divine intervention. There was a rest area, like exit right there. So I pulled over, I pulled my car into the spot, and I said, "Is this about Glenn?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, Glenn had died because of his last relapse. And he just wanted to let me know. And I thanked him and hung up. And then I sat there in the car, looking out the window for probably 20 or 30 minutes. And I thought to myself, maybe it would have been better if I had made that decision earlier on that I wasn't going to do this. Because I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well. Glenn was in his 60s, and he was repeatedly relapsing on crystal meth, a very serious and very deadly drug. I started to feel like, this is just going to have a bad end. And so maybe I shouldn't have continued the friendship. And then I thought about all of those afternoons. I thought about how sweet he was. I thought about what a kind person he was. I thought about how he had surmounted obstacles that many people would find extraordinarily difficult to surmount. I thought about how it made sense that after he left that abusive situation that he grew up in and made it to California only to lose the love of his life, that he'd seek some kind of relief. I didn't hold that against him. Of course he tried to seek some relief. And then I realized that I admired, even though he repeatedly relapsed, I admired that he still tried to hold on to hope that maybe he could finally kick this demon, and that there was something strong in that. And that probably, even though at the end it did catch up with him, it probably let him live a much longer life than he might have otherwise. As I was sitting there looking out the window and thinking about all of these moments that I had with him, and all of these moments that I wouldn't have had if I had just cut that relationship off, his words came back to me. The words from that first time that one of the first times that we met as we were talking about prayer. And he said that prayer is not stealing something from the future. Prayer is about being grateful for what you have right now. And in each of those moments, even though I wanted to steal from the future, I wanted him to get better, I wanted there to be a different outcome to this, even though I worried deep down that might not be what happens, and that at the end of all of this, his drug use was going to catch up with him. Even though I had all of those worries, even though my prayers for him would have looked much more along the lines of, I want him to change and I want the future to look different for him. Those were my prayers for him. Even though all of that was true, I thought about those words. It's being thankful for what you have right now. And each of those moments that I had with Glenn, each of those afternoons, each of those times over coffee, all of that, even the hard memories, even the bad ones, I was grateful that I got to have that in my life. The parable of the prodigal son is not about repentance. It's not about knowing that this person you care for is going to change their life and do exactly what you want them to do. That evidence is not in the parable. And it turns the father into a fool, right? It turns the father into a fool because the father is like, I'm just gonna meet up again. I'm gonna have another meeting with my son. I'm gonna have this party for my son. I'm gonna celebrate with my son, even though the evidence is probably that his son will not change his ways, or at least there's a high probability that that might be the outcome. And yet the father does that anyway. And so when I think about the parable, and I think about the father being a fool, I think that maybe he's a wise fool. I think that maybe there is a way in which, even though he's making a decision that might to others seem foolish, he is making a choice to say, maybe today is all I've got. Maybe today is all the person that I love has got. And I am going to savor that and be thankful for it. I'm going to have lunch with my son, and we are going to have a good time, even though I don't have certainty about what the outcome of all of this will be. Now, I have lots of caveats, and I feel like I could just talk about this on and on and on, way past the length of our service. And one of my really important caveats here, I have two that I want to mention. One of them is that I know many of us struggle with setting boundaries around relationships where people have taken advantage of us. And so I don't want the message that I'm saying today, I don't want the message to be just give up on those boundaries and kind of let a person who may be difficult and doing really problematic things just have free reign and come back into your life and bring enormous amounts of chaos. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that there might be small moments in even the most complicated relationships that you are able to savor. Find those and hold on to them and say to yourself, maybe this is all I've got, but maybe this is the most important and beautiful and true thing in my life right now and in their life right now. And then the other thing that I want to say is that I want to make sure it doesn't sound like I'm a fatalist, that, because I suspected that Glenn might die this way, that I sort of have this view that of course, if they show this pattern, they're going to end up in this particular place, because I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a minute. I have seen so many stories that have been miraculous, where people have come back from enormously difficult situations and enormously difficult personal issues and demons that they have fought with and battled over, and been able to create a new and beautiful life. Sometimes when I'm giving pastoral care to someone, they say to me, I don't I don't really have hope for myself right now because this feels so hard and so heavy and so dark. And so what I often tell that person is that you may not have that faith right now, and you may feel that that hope is impossible to hold for yourself right now. So what I'm gonna do with you as we're sitting here is I'm gonna hold that hope for the both of us, because I really do believe that that kind of change is possible. But my message today is that even if the change doesn't happen, even if the outcome isn't the one that we had hoped for, maybe there are still these bright, sparkling moments that we can clasp hold of and celebrate and kill the fatted calf for. Maybe that is still possible. Unitarian Universalism is all about how do we live with love. And this is one of the ways that we can find that love to share with each other, even in situations that are very, very hard and difficult. And of course, if this sermon has brought anything up for you that you feel like you would need a listening ear or additional support, please know that I'm here. I'm always here for you, and I'm always happy to talk to you about whatever is coming up. My spiritual companions, I love you in 1,000 different ways. And in that spirit of love, let us go forth into our lives and out into the world. Blessed be.